Imagine a world ablaze with religious fervor, where the deepest convictions fuel epic journeys and, well, brutal conflicts spanning continents and centuries. What happens when that yearning for spiritual redemption clashes head-on with the hunger for land, power, and, glory? Welcome to History Unraveled. Today we're plunging into the heart of the Crusades, a sprawling, complex saga that reshaped the medieval world and whose echoes, honestly, still resonate today.
Exactly. And when we say the Crusades, it's easy to picture like a single defined war, but it's really more accurate to think of a whole series of interconnected religious wars,
Yeah.
mainly kicked off by the Christian Latin Church in the West.
Yeah, these weren't just quick skirmishes either. They unfolded over centuries, leaving this massive mark on everyone involved.
Absolutely. And while the term covers conflicts in different places, the ones that really grab our imagination are those big expeditions to the Holy Land. The dramatic attempts between roughly 1095 and 1291 to wrest Jerusalem and the sacred sites back from Muslim rule.
Just think about it. Armies marching vast distances, driven by faith, by the promise of salvation, colliding with these, well, established powers in the East.
A region, of course, that held immense significance for Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. Jerusalem had actually been under Muslim control for centuries by then, since the early days of Islam's expansion back in the 7th century.
Right, so the Crusaders arriving wasn't the start of conflict there, more like a really dramatic new chapter in a long, and pretty complex history.
Precisely.
Now for you, the listener, maybe you're keen to grasp the essentials without getting totally bogged down in endless dates and names. That's kind of our mission today. We want to distill the most crucial insights from the historical record, give you a clear path to understanding this really transformative era.
Yeah, we want to get into the motivations, the key turning points, the lasting consequences, but without feeling like you're drowning in, a textbook.
Exactly. We're aiming for understanding without the overwhelm.
And our exploration is built on, well, a huge amount of historical accounts and the analysis of countless scholars who've dedicated their lives to figuring out the Crusades. We want to go beyond just listing battles.
Right. We want to uncover the driving forces, what made people do this, and how did it reshape everything, both in Europe and the Middle East.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. By the late 11th century, that big initial wave of Islamic Arab conquests, it had largely settled down. And interestingly, the Holy Land itself, Palestine, Syria, it had actually seen a period of relative stability, even some prosperity, under the rule of the Fatimids.
That's a really important point. The image we sometimes get of like nonstop war in the Holy Land right before the Crusades is just not quite right. Sure, there were regional conflicts, but the Fatimid Caliphate, they were a Shiite Muslim dynasty. They generally kept control and, importantly, allowed Christian pilgrimages. There were rules, of course, but it was possible.
And Western Europe's interaction with that specific part of the world, it was maybe less intense compared to, say, Spain, right?
Generally, yes. Meanwhile, the real powerhouses of the time were the Byzantine Empire to the north and west of the Holy Land, and the various Islamic states sprawling to the east and south. These were the centers of wealth, culture, military might.
And how did they see Western Europe?
Well, Western Europe was still kind of emerging from the early Middle Ages, so these Eastern powers often saw it as, well, maybe less sophisticated, less influential, a collection of relatively minor kingdoms compared to their own vast empires.
Kind of looked down on them a bit.
Maybe not always looked down, but certainly viewed them as less central to the grand scheme of things. The Arab and Byzantine worlds, with their long histories, developed administrations. They often saw the fragmented kingdoms of the West with a degree of maybe indifference. They had their own complex politics to deal with.
Okay, let's rewind just a bit more. By 1025, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, he'd pushed the empire's borders pretty far east, hadn't he? Towards modern Iran.
He had. Byzantium controlled a huge swath of the eastern Mediterranean Balkans, parts of Italy. Their relationship with Islamic neighbors was complex, sure, but not necessarily more hostile than their dealings with, say, Normans in Italy or nomads up north.
So they were used to dealing with lots of different groups.
Very much so. The Byzantine Empire was sophisticated, resilient. They were skilled at diplomacy, military strategy. They often used mercenaries from all sorts of backgrounds, even groups they sometimes fought against to handle pressure on their borders.
Which brings us to the Seljuk Turks. Their arrival in the 10th century, That really changed the game, didn't it?
Absolutely. They started as this relatively minor clan from Central Asia, converted to Sunni Islam, and then just exploded across Persia. In a few decades, they swept through Iran, Iraq, and started pushing into the Near East.
And being Sunni Muslims put them directly at odds with the Shiite Fatimids ruling the Holy Land.
Exactly. That created this immediate religious and political fault line right through the region. Added a whole new layer of tension, instability, right where the Crusades would eventually focus.
And culturally, the Seljuks were quite different from the Arabic-speaking people they conquered.
Very different. They had this nomadic Turkic background. Their governance often relied more on personal loyalties, individual princes' ambitions, rather than a centralized bureaucratic state like the Fatimids or Byzantines.
Which weakened things locally.
It did. It led to a kind of political fragmentation, some instability, and the early Crusaders, maybe without even realizing it at first, ended up exploiting that lack of a single unified Muslim power, made coordinated resistance much harder.
Okay, then 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. Big Byzantine defeat, emperor captured. For ages, that was seen as the trigger for the Crusades, right?
That was the traditional narrative, yeah. And Manzikert was definitely a huge blow to Byzantium, lost them a lot of ground in Anatolia. But modern historians tend to see it more as one really significant step in the Seljuk expansion, rather than the single direct cause of the Crusades.
So not the only factor.
Not the only one. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, kept going for centuries. It remained a major player. It's more complex than just Manzikert happened than Crusades.
Got it. So while all this is happening in the East, what's going on with Christian ideas about war back in the West?
Well, there's an evolution happening there too. Early on, you had this link between being a Roman citizen and being Christian. Defending the empire was kind of a civic and religious duty. Then St. Augustine, back in the 4th century, he lays the groundwork for the idea of a just war.
Right, the idea that war could be okay under certain conditions.
Exactly. Augustine argued, look, violence is bad, but war might be morally justifiable if it's waged by a legitimate authority, has a just cause like defense or getting back stolen lands, and is done with the right intention, meaning avoiding needless cruelty. Those ideas became really central.
But in Western Europe at this time, violence was still pretty common, even between Christians.
Oh, absolutely. The church tried to limit it with things like the peace and truce of God movements, trying to say, okay, you can't fight on Sundays or attack clergy, that kind of thing. How effective they really were by the late 11th century.
Yeah.
Historians still debate that.
Did those movements maybe channel aggression outwards towards non-Christians?
Some scholars think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe fostered this idea of righteous violence that should be directed at perceived enemies of Christendom. Others think the direct link to the Crusades is a bit tenuous.
What we do know is the church got more involved in military stuff in the 11th century. Popes like Alexander II, Gregory VII, they started recruiting soldiers using oaths of loyalty.
Yes, and we see church-backed military actions against Muslims on the edges of Europe, like in Spain or the Norman conquest of Sicily. These definitely foreshadowed some of the language and organization used later for the Holy Land Crusades, showed the church was increasingly willing to use military force for what it saw as righteous goals.
And Gregory VII even had a plan back in 1074 for a holy war to help Byzantium against the Turks. It didn't happen, but the idea was there.
Exactly. It's often seen as a kind of prototype for the Crusades. Shows the concept of a big, Pope-blessed military expedition was already floating around, even before Urban II's big speech.
Okay, let's bring it back to Jerusalem itself. Hugely important for Christians, obviously. Site of the crucifixion, resurrection, the ultimate pilgrimage destination.
Absolutely. People undertook these incredibly tough journeys just to walk where Jesus walked. That deep spiritual connection is crucial to understanding the appeal of the Crusades.
And then also, in 1071, around the time of Manzikert, Jerusalem gets captured by a Turkish warlord at seas, part of that Seljuk expansion.
Right, taken from the Fatimids. And while Seljuk control was maybe a bit shaky at first, stories started coming back to the West from pilgrims. Stories about increasing difficulties, restrictions, even oppression of Christian visitors.
And those stories fueled concern back home.
Definitely. They added to this growing sense of unease, even outrage about what was happening in the Holy City.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing. Byzantium needs help. Western knights are increasingly willing to fight for the church, and there's this deep religious worry about Jerusalem and pilgrims.
It's that potent mix. The Byzantine need for aid, Western readiness for papal military direction, and that intense focus on Jerusalem. It all converges. The stage is set for the First Crusade.
Even contemporary chroniclers were a bit surprised by the sheer scale of it, weren't they?
They were. It seemed to come out of nowhere in some ways. But when you look at all those underlying currents, political, religious, social, religionary, you can see how the potential for something massive was building.
Right, 1095. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, feeling the heat from the Seljuks, sends envoys to Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza. He's asking for help. What kind of help did he likely have in mind?
Probably a fairly modest group of well-trained Western mercenaries. Fighters he could integrate into his own Byzantine army to help push back the Turks. Alexios was pragmatic. He needed practical military support.
But Pope Urban II, he saw something much bigger, didn't he?
Oh, much bigger. Later that same year, at the Council of Clermont in France, he doesn't just relay Alexios' request. He delivers this incredibly powerful sermon, basically launching the First Crusade as a distinct movement.
And the response was huge.
Extraordinary. Urban's speech, we don't have the exact words, but it clearly hit a nerve. Tapped into religious piety, desire for adventure, existing traditions of pilgrimage, holy war, the works. Almost immediately, this charismatic preacher, Peter the Hermit, starts rallying huge crowds, mostly poorer folk. That became the People's Crusade.
A real outpouring of popular religious feeling.
Totally. Ordinary people, convinced they were doing God's work, promised spiritual rewards, just dropped everything and started marching east. But tragically, this first wave was also marked by horrific violence.
The attacks on Jewish communities in the Rhineland.
Yes. As these largely untrained, poorly equipped groups moved through Germany, they unleashed these brutal massacres. It's a really dark, shameful part of the story.
Why did that happen?
It seems for some, the goal of liberating the Holy Sepulchre got horribly tangled up with existing anti-Jewish hatred. Jews were blamed for Christ's death, seen as enemies, and they were, tragically, much closer and more vulnerable targets than Muslims miles away. It's a disturbing question, isn't it? Why travel so far to fight one group when you're inflicting such violence on another right there?
And the People's Crusade itself. It didn't end well militarily, did it?
Not at all. They were ill-prepared, undisciplined. Once they crossed into Seljuk territory in Asia Minor, near Nicaea, they were ambushed by a Turkish force at Sivai Tad and basically wiped out. A brutal lesson in the difference between religious zeal and actual military capability.
So the official First Crusade, the one led by the nobles, was more organized?
More organized, yes, though still incredibly challenging. Interestingly, the big monarchs, King Philip I of France, Emperor Henry I of Germany, they stayed out of it, mostly because they were in conflict with Pope Urban. But a powerful group of aristocrats stepped up.
Or the key players?
You had Raymond IV of Toulouse, a wealthy, experienced southern French count. Then the ambitious Normans from Italy, Bohemond of Taranto, and his nephew Tancred. And Godfrey Bouillon, a major lord from Lower Lorraine, along with his brother Baldwin. Those were the big names, each with their own armies and, frankly, their own agendas.
And they brought substantial forces.
Oh yeah. Plus contingents from northern France, led by people like Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror's son Stephen of Blois, Robert of Flanders. All told, maybe tens of thousands of knights and soldiers, and possibly up to 100,000 people total if you count all the pilgrims, servants, and hangers-on.
An enormous logistical nightmare, surely.
Absolutely. These different armies traveled east separately, facing their own problems, eventually gathering outside Constantinople. Emperor Alexios watched them arrive with, you can imagine, mixed feelings, apprehension, but also strategic calculation.
He was wary of this huge armed mob on his doorstep.
Understandably. He skillfully negotiated with the leaders, got most of them to swear oaths, promising to return any former Byzantine lands they reconquered, and he cleverly directed their first target, Nicaea, the nearby Seljuk capital.
Good timing for the Crusaders, too, wasn't it?
Very. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilid Arslan, was actually away dealing with another conflict when the Crusaders arrived and besieged Nicaea in spring 1097. This allowed a combined attack Crusaders by land, Byzantines by lake with their navy. That cooperation was key to taking the city.
After Nicaea, they ran into the Turks properly at Dorylaeum.
Yes, July 1097. The Crusader advance guard, mostly Normans under Bohemond, got ambushed by a large force of Turkish mounted archers. Light armor, very mobile, raining down arrows.
A shock for the heavily armored knights.
A huge shock. They were used to charging in close combat. Now they're stuck in formation, getting peppered with arrows by enemies who just wouldn't stand still. They held out for hours, incredibly bravely, until the main Crusader army under Godfrey and Raymond arrived and counterattacked, driving the Turks off. A hard win, but a vital lesson learned.
And then the march towards Antioch began, across Anatolia. That sounds brutal.
It was horrific. 3 months across this arid, unforgiving landscape. Heat, lack of water, dwindling food for this massive host, starvation, thirst, disease. It ravaged their numbers, just relentless attrition.
And during this march, Baldwin splits off.
He does. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, takes a contingent east towards Edessa, sees an opportunity, gets involved in local politics with the Armenian Christians there, and ends up establishing his own independent territory, the county of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states, but it also fragmented their forces.
Finally, they reach Antioch, a major city, heavily fortified. The siege there, it took forever, right?
8 long months,
Yeah.
from October 1097 to June 1098. The Crusaders didn't really have the gear or supplies for a proper siege, and the defenders couldn't break out decisively. It was just this grim stalemate, disease, hunger for the attackers, constant tension.
How did they finally get in?
A bit of strategy, a bit of betrayal. Bohemond, always looking for an angle, made a secret deal with an Armenian guard inside called Firuz. Firuz was apparently disgruntled. For a reward, he agreed to let a small group of Crusaders scale the walls under cover of darkness.
And once they were inside,
Chaos and massacre. They opened the gates, the main army poured in, and there was horrific, indiscriminate killing of the Muslim inhabitants. Tragically, many local Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syrian, Armenian, got caught up in it too, mistaken for enemies or collaborators. A really brutal episode.
but their troubles weren't over yet.
Not by a long shot. Almost immediately, a massive Muslim relief army led by Kerboga of Mosul arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside Antioch. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. Starving, trapped. Things looked incredibly bleak.
And this is when Stephen of Blois deserts and convinces Emperor Alexios the cause is lost.
Exactly. Stephen had already left, got back to Alexios, and basically said, "It's hopeless, they're doomed." So Alexios, hearing this, turned his own relief force back. The Crusaders in Antioch felt utterly abandoned, created huge resentment towards the Byzantines that lasted for years. Stephen, meanwhile, was labeled a coward forever after.
So the Crusaders are trapped, starving, besieged by Kerboga. What happens?
They try to negotiate, but Kerboga refuses any surrender terms. Bohemond again steps up, rallies the remaining desperate forces for one last, seemingly suicidal gamble, a breakout attack.
Against Kerboga's huge army. How?
It's one of those astonishing moments in history.
Yeah.
Late June 1098, significantly outnumbered, weakened, they launched this furious assault. Maybe it was religious fervor, desperation, Bohemond's leadership, who knows. But Kerboga's army, possibly a bit divided internally, was caught completely off guard. They broke and fled. The Crusaders, against all odds, had defeated the besiegers. A stunning, pivotal victory.
While all that drama was unfolding in Antioch, Raymond of Toulouse was doing his own thing.
Yeah, he'd been besieging a fortress called Arca, further south. He also sent feelers out to the Fatimids in Egypt, trying to see if a deal was possible. Sadly, the papal legate Adhamar died around this time, which was a big loss for morale and leadership. Raymond failed at Arca, eventually marched his troops south along the coast.
And Bohemond decided to keep Antioch for himself, despite his oath to Alexios.
He did, pragmatic as ever, saw the strategic value, wasn't about to hand it over,
Yeah.
and the local Muslim rulers nearby. They saw the Crusaders beat Kerboga and decided making peace and providing supplies was safer than fighting them.
What about those envoys Raymond sent to Egypt?
They came back eventually with Fatimid officials, and they brought big news. The Fatimids had actually just recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks. They offered the Crusaders access for a pilgrimage, maybe an alliance against the Seljuks, but absolutely refused to hand over Jerusalem itself.
So negotiation was off the table. Taking Jerusalem by force became the only option left.
Pretty much. It made reaching the Holy City absolutely imperative.
Their first assault on Jerusalem, June 1099, it failed.
Failed badly. Bloody repulse. They settled into another difficult siege. Lacked the right equipment, suffering in the heat, supplies low again. The key moment was the arrival of Genoese ships at Jaffa, bringing craftsmen and vital materials.
That allowed them to build proper siege engines.
Exactly. Siege towers, battering rams. After weeks of construction, they launched a major assault. On July 15th, 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon's men, using a siege tower, finally breached the walls.
And what followed was the infamous sack of Jerusalem.
Yes. 2 days of intense, brutal fighting, massacre, and looting inside the city. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, probably exaggerated the death toll for dramatic effect, but it was undoubtedly horrific. A deeply traumatic event that cemented the Franks' image in the Muslim world as ruthless invaders.
After taking the city, Godfrey moved quickly to defend it.
He did, defeated a large Fatimid army coming up from Egypt at the Battle of Ascalon in August, prevented an immediate counterattack. With Jerusalem secure, their main goal achieved, most surviving crusaders felt their vows were fulfilled and headed home to Europe.
Leaving Godfrey in charge. But he didn't call himself king initially.
Right. He took the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchre, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Maybe humility, maybe politics. His own troops from Lorraine were a strong presence, preventing maybe the church or Raymond of Toulouse from taking over. But he was left with a surprisingly small force to hold this huge prize.
Though other leaders like Tancred stayed, looking to carve out their own territories.
Oh yes. The ambition didn't just disappear. Tancred and others were definitely looking to establish their own principalities.
How did the wider Muslim world react initially? You said it was surprisingly muted.
It seems so, yes. Very little written evidence of a big immediate reaction before the 1130s. Partly maybe reluctance to record a major defeat, but also likely a fundamental misunderstanding. Some leaders, like the Fatimid vizier al-Afdal, might have just seen them as another batch of Byzantine mercenaries, not realizing they intended to stay, conquer, and settle.
Plus, the Muslim world itself was very divided at the time.
Hugely divided. You had the Sunni Shiite split between Syria, Iraq, and Fatimid Egypt. And the Seljuk Empire had fractured after Sultan Malik Shah died in 1092. Different Seljuk princes controlled cities like Damascus and Aleppo, often fighting each other more than worrying about the Franks far away in Jerusalem.
And even the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was weak.
Yeah, locked in a power struggle with the Seljuk Sultan there. All this internal conflict and lack of unity gave the Crusaders a crucial breathing space, a window to consolidate their initial gains without facing a massive, coordinated counteroffensive right away.
So the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade, Urban II actually died just after Jerusalem fell, right? Before the news even reached him.
He did, a strange irony. His successor, Pope Paschal II, continued the policies supporting the new Crusader states in the Holy Land.
And Godfrey of Bouillon didn't last long either, died in 1100.
Correct. His death sparked a bit of a power struggle. Dagobert of Pisa, the Patriarch, and Tancred tried to get Bohemond, who was still up in Antioch, to come south and take over. But Bohemond actually got captured by the Danishmends, another Turkish group, around that time.
So who ended up taking charge in Jerusalem?
The Lotharingians, Godfrey's original followers, were crucial. They blocked Dagobert and Tancred's plans and made sure Godfrey's brother, Baldwin, the one who'd gone off to Edessa, could come down and become the first king of Jerusalem. Baldwin I.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, Pope Paschal II tried to launch another big crusade, the Crusade of 1101.
Yes, a very large-scale effort, maybe similar in size to the First Crusade initially. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who'd felt a bit cheated out of power after the first one, joined up with him in Byzantium. But it was a disaster.
What went wrong?
Fragmented command, poor leadership. The force split into three main groups, and all three were decisively defeated by Kilij Arslan, the same Seljuk Sultan they'd beaten at Nicaea and Dorylaeum in battles like Mersavan and Heraclea in Anatolia. Most of the leaders survived, but the armies were shattered. Another contingent under William the X of Aquitaine met a similar fate.
So these defeats showed the Muslims the Crusaders weren't invincible.
Exactly. It was a major reality check. The remnants of these forces did help Raymond eventually capture the coastal city of Tortosa, strengthening his county of Tripoli, but the overall crusade was a failure.
Back in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin I faced challenges from Egypt.
Constantly. There were several major battles around Ramla. Baldwin won a narrow victory in 1101, then suffered a major defeat in 1102, where key figures like Stephen of Blois, the one who deserted Antioch, were killed. Baldwin himself had to flee. But then the Franks rallied and won a crucial battle at Jaffa in 1102, saving the kingdom, followed by another victory near Ramla against a combined Fatimid Damascene force. It was a constant back and forth.
What about Bohemond, who was captured?
He was eventually ransomed by Baldwin of Edessa, Baldwin III's cousin and successor in Edessa, and the Patriarch of Antioch. Once free, he and Baldwin campaigned together to secure Edessa's southern border, but they suffered a bad defeat at Haran in 1104. Baldwin of Edessa himself was captured there, along with Jocelyn of Courtenay, another important Frankish lord.
So Tancred took over in Antioch.
Yes. Bohemond decided to head back to Italy, taking a lot of Antioch's wealth and manpower with him, supposedly to raise a new crusade. Tancred stepped in as regent and actually revitalized Antioch, winning a significant victory at Arta in 1105.
Did Bohemond ever come back?
He did raise a new force, but instead of going to the Holy Land, he launched a crusade against the Byzantine Empire in 1107. He besieged Durrës, but it failed. He was forced into the Treaty of Deval, basically acknowledging Byzantine overlordship, but the terms were never really enacted because Bohemond died in Italy in 1111. Tancred remained regent in Antioch for Bohemond's young son.
And Baldwin of Edessa eventually got released.
Yes, Jocelyn of Courtenay was ransomed first, and he negotiated Baldwin's release in 1107. But then Tancred and the newly freed Baldwin actually fought each other over control of Edessa. It got pretty nasty, until the Patriarch of Antioch stepped in and ruled in Baldwin's favor.
So Baldwin I in Jerusalem, Tancred, then his successor in Antioch, Baldwin II at Edessa, and Raymond, then his successors in Tripoli. Those are the main Crusader states consolidating.
Pretty much. Baldwin had continued expanding the Kingdom of Jerusalem, capturing coastal cities like Beirut in 1110 with Genoese help, and Sidon in 1111 with help from Norwegian crusaders led by King Sigurd.
Were there major Muslim counterattacks during this time?
There were attempts. The Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Atapar tried to recover Syria in 1111, but the Franks held firm at Edessa. There was a big battle at Shaizar in 1111 where Tancred faced an Abbasid army, but it was inconclusive. After Tancred died in 1112, his nephew Roger of Salerno took over Antioch.
Things seem quite messy, lots of shifting alliances and conflicts.
Very messy. Maudud of Mosul invaded Galilee in 1113, defeated the Franks, but was then assassinated. Another Seljuk army under Bursuk ibn Bursuk came in 1115, but the Franks actually allied with some local Muslim rulers from Damascus and Aleppo against him. The coalition fell apart, but Roger of Salerno and Baldwin of Edessa then won a surprising victory against Bursuk at Tel Danith, despite being outnumbered.
Then Baldwin I, the first king of Jerusalem, dies in 1118.
Yes, and Baldwin of Edessa is elected to succeed him, becoming King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Almost immediately, Antioch faced a major threat from El-Ghazi of Aleppo. Roger of Salerno rashly attacked El-Ghazi's larger army in 1119 and was utterly defeated and killed at the Battle of Ager Sangrinus, the Field of Blood, a disaster for Antioch.
So Baldwin II had to step in.
He did, rushed north, fought El-Ghazi again near Tel Danith, inconclusive, but it stopped the immediate offensive. Baldwin II really became the linchpin holding the Crusader states together during this period.
What were some key developments under Baldwin II?
The Council of Nablus in 1120 established a formal law code for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It also marked the first direct appeals for support to the papacy in Venice. This led to the Venetian Crusade of 1122-1124, where a large Venetian fleet helped capture the crucial port city of Tyre.
And Baldwin II himself got captured again?
Yes, captured by Dalek Ghazi in 1123 while campaigning near Edessa. He was released a year later after agreeing to pay a ransom and hand over the town of Azaz. Despite these setbacks, his reign saw important developments.
Like the Knights Templar getting official recognition.
Exactly. The Council of Troyes in 1129 formally approved the rule of the Knights Templar for Hughes de Payenne. Hughes returned east with a new force, including Fulk of Anjou, a powerful French count. They launched a campaign in 1129, captured Banias, but failed in an attack on Damascus. That defeat kind of reduced Frankish influence over Damascus for a while.
And Baldwin II arranged important marriages to strengthen ties with the West.
Very important ones. His daughters were married off strategically. Constance of Antioch married Raymond of Poitiers, and crucially, Melisande of Jerusalem married Fulk of Vith of Anjou in 1129. This was designed to secure the succession.
So when Baldwin II died in 1131, Fulk and Melisande became joint rulers.
They did. It wasn't entirely smooth sailing. Fulk initially tried to sideline Melisande, leading to conflict with the established Jerusalem nobility who supported her rights. Eventually, they reconciled, and Melisande wielded considerable influence. After Fulk died in a hunting accident in 1143, she became regent and joint ruler with their young son, Baldwin III.
While the Franks were dealing with internal politics and succession, a new major threat was emerging on the Muslim side.
Yes, Imad ad-Din Zengi, a powerful Turkish ruler who became Atabeg, or governor, of Mosul in 1127 and then took Aleppo in 1128. Zengi was ambitious, capable, and crucially, he started to successfully unite various Syrian emirates under his rule, framing his campaigns against the Franks in the language of jihad, or holy war.
He started putting pressure on Antioch.
He did. Moved against Antioch around 1135, capturing several towns while the Crusaders struggled to field an army against him. He defeated King Fulk at Barin in 1137 and captured the castle there.
Zengi also attacked Tripoli.
Invaded Tripoli in 1137, killing Count Pons. Fulk intervened, but Zengi managed to capture Pons' successor, Raymond II, and besieged Fulk himself at Montferrand. Fulk had to surrender the fortress and pay a ransom to get Raymond released. Zengi was proving a formidable opponent.
Did the Byzantines get involved around this time?
Yes, Emperor John II Komnenos came down to Syria to reassert Byzantine claims over Seleucia and Antioch. Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, was forced to pay homage to him. They launched a joint Byzantine-Frankish siege of Aleppo in 1138, but it failed. Another siege at Shazar was also abandoned. The cooperation wasn't entirely successful.
Then King Fulk dies in 1143.
Right, that hunting accident, leaving his young son Baldwin III and Queen Melisande as co-rulers. Around the same time, Emperor John II Komnenos also died, succeeded by his son Manuel I. The Byzantine army that had been campaigning in the region withdrew after John's death.
Leaving Zengi unopposed.
Pretty much. And Fulk's death left Jocelyn II, the Count of Edessa, particularly vulnerable. Zengi saw his chance. In late 1144, he laid siege to Edessa.
And Edessa fell.
It did. On December 24, 1144, the city fell to Zengi's forces. The Frankish defenders who were captured were executed, though the native Christian population was initially spared. This was a massive shock. The fall of Edessa was the first major Crusader state capital to be lost, a huge blow to morale in the West.
What happened to Zengi after this triumph?
Ironically, he didn't get to enjoy it for long. He was assassinated by one of his own slaves in 1146. His territories were divided, with his capable son, Nur ad-Din, taking control of Aleppo and continuing the fight against the Franks.
Did the Franks try to retake Edessa?
They did, briefly. Jocelyn II managed to sneak back into the city during a second siege in 1146, while Nur ad-Din was temporarily distracted. But they couldn't capture the citadel. Nur ad-Din quickly returned, counter-besieged the city, and retook it definitively. This time, the Frankish men were massacred, women and children enslaved, and the city walls razed. Edessa was lost for good.
And the fall of Edessa is what directly triggers the Second Crusade.
Absolutely. The news caused huge consternation back in Europe. Calls went out for a new major crusade, this time led by the kings of Europe themselves. It coincided with other crusading efforts, two renewed campaigns in the Reconquista in Spain and the Northern Crusades against pagans in the Baltic. But the main focus was responding to the loss of Edessa, and Pope Eugene III formally called for it with the papal bull Quantum Predecessors in 1145. The incredibly influential Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux became the main preacher, traveling across Europe and whipping up support. He offered the same papal indulgences forgiveness of sins that had motivated the First Crusade.
And this time, kings answered the call.
Yes, most notably King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. A massive undertaking, much more centrally organized, at least in theory, than the First Crusade.
How'd it go? The German contingent set off first.
Conrad III and the Germans left in May 1147. They immediately ran into trouble with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Komnenos, who was wary of another huge Western army passing through. There was even a brief skirmish outside Constantinople. The Germans then moved quickly into Asia Minor.
And ran into the Seljuks.
Yes, the Seljuks of Rum, under Sultan Masud I. At the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, near the site of the First Crusade's victory, the Germans were decisively defeated in October 1147. Conrad himself was wounded, and his army largely disintegrated.
What about the French?
Louis VII and the French contingent left in June 1147. Their passage was also complicated because Roger II of Sicily, a Norman rival of Byzantium, chose that moment to invade Byzantine territory, which limited Manuel's ability or willingness to help the French.
Did the French and Germans meet up?
The French met the remnants of Conrad's shattered army in western Turkey. Conrad decided to join Louis's force. They won a couple of minor victories against the Turks near Ephesus and the Meander River late in 1147. But then, in January 1148, while crossing Mount Cadmus, the French army was ambushed and suffered very heavy losses.
Another disaster in Anatolia.
Pretty much. The survivors, demoralized and depleted, eventually managed to sail from the coast to Antioch, arriving in March 1148.
So their original goal was to retake Edessa, right?
That was the initial impetus. But once they arrived in the Holy Land, things got complicated. Baldwin III, the young king of Jerusalem, along with the powerful Knights Templar, argued for attacking Damascus instead.
Damascus? Weren't they sometimes allied with Jerusalem against Zengi's family?
They had been, but the political situation had shifted. Damascus was now more closely aligned with the Zengids under Nur ad-Din. The Jerusalem barons saw Damascus as a more immediate threat and a more strategically valuable prize than distant, ruined Edessa.
So they held a big council to decide.
Yes, the Council of Acre in June 1148. All the big players were there: Louis, Conrad, Baldwin, Melisande, the masters of the military orders, and they formally agreed to change the objective to Damascus. This decision is still debated by historians. Was it strategically sound or a fatal error?
How did the attack on Damascus go?
Disastrously. There had been an inconclusive clash near Basra earlier, but the main siege of Damascus began on July 24, 1148. It lasted only 5 days. A combination of bad luck, poor tactical decisions like Shifting the attack to a less favorable side of the city and possibly mistrust among the leaders led to failure.
What happened?
The local Jerusalem barons, perhaps fearing the European kings would take Damascus for themselves, or maybe genuinely believing the siege was failing, withdrew their support. Facing dwindling supplies and the imminent arrival of a relief army under Nur ad-Din, the Crusaders had no choice but to abandon the siege and retreat ignominiously.
A total failure. What were the consequences?
Huge blow to morale. Deepened hostility towards the Byzantines, who were blamed, perhaps unfairly, for some of the failures. Created distrust between the newly arrived European Crusaders and the established Frankish settlers in the Holy Land. The French and Germans felt betrayed. The whole thing just fizzled out, damaging the prestige of the Christian kingdoms and, paradoxically, strengthening the hand of Nur ad-Din in Syria.
What about those other crusades happening at the same time, in Spain and the Baltic?
Pope Eugene III had authorized expanding the crusading focus to the Iberian Peninsula in 1147, explicitly equating the campaigns against the Moors there with the Second Crusade. This actually led to some notable successes. The Anglo-Flemish Crusaders helped capture Lisbon in October 1147, and the Aragonese captured Tortosa in late 1148.
So more success there than in the Holy Land.
Ironically, yes. And the Wendish Crusade in 1147 against pagan Slavs in northern Germany was partially successful militarily, though it largely failed in its goal of converting the Wends to Christianity at that time.
But the main event, the Holy Land part, was a disaster.
An unmitigated disaster. Damaged the papacy's standing, soured relations between Byzantium and the West, emboldened the Syrian Muslims under Nur ad-Din, and ultimately set the stage for the rise of Saladin, the fall of Jerusalem decades later, and the Third Crusade.
So Nur ad-Din really capitalized on the failure of the Second Crusade.
He certainly did. Just a year later, in June 1149, his forces decisively defeated and destroyed the army of Antioch at the Battle of Inab. Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, Eleanor of Aquitaine's uncle, actually was killed in the battle. His head was reportedly cut off and sent in a silver box to the Caliph in Baghdad, a major blow.
What about Edessa? Was Jocelyn II still around?
Nur ad-Din defeated Jocelyn II for the final time in 1150. Jocelyn was captured, blinded, and died in prison years later. Nur ad-Din did fail to stop King Baldwin III from evacuating the Christian residents of Turbisal, the last remnant of the county of Edessa, but the territory itself fell to the Zendids soon after.
And Tripoli suffered losses too.
Yes. Count Raymond II of Tripoli was actually murdered in 1152, becoming the first prominent Frankish victim of the mysterious order of assassins. Nur ad-Din took advantage, capturing and briefly occupying Tortosa before the Knights Templar took it over and made it their headquarters.
But the big prize for Nur ad-Din was Damascus.
Absolutely. After the Crusaders had successfully captured the Fatimid stronghold of Ascalon on the coast in 1153, a major victory for Baldwin III, Nur ad-Din finally managed to take control of Damascus the following year. This was huge. It united Muslim Syria under his rule for the first time since the Seljuk fragmentation.
How did Baldwin III react?
He was forced into a temporary treaty with Nur ad-Din in 1156. Later, he sought an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I. There were ongoing skirmishes. Nur ad-Din besieged a hospitaller force at Banayas in 1157, capturing their Grand Master. Baldwin III broke the siege but was then ambushed himself. It was constant back and forth, minor victories and defeats for both sides, like the Crusader victory at Lake Hula in 1157 and another at Butayha in 1158.
Baldwin III dies relatively young, doesn't he, in 1163?
He does, succeeded by his brother Amalric. Amalric was ambitious and turned his attention south, towards Fatimid Egypt, which was seen as weak and wealthy.
Amalric launched invasions of Egypt.
4 major invasions between 1163 and 1169. He was trying to exploit the internal weaknesses and factional struggles within the Fatimid regime. But Nur ad-Din saw the danger of Egypt falling into Frankish hands. He intervened in the first invasion, sending his trusted general Shirkuh, along with Shirkuh's young nephew Saladin, into Egypt.
So this is Saladin's entry onto the stage, as part of Nur ad-Din's forces defending Egypt from the Crusaders.
Exactly, it gets complicated. The deposed Fatimid vizier, Shawar, actually allied himself with Amalric against Shirkuh at one point. They besieged Shirkuh together in Bilbis in 1164. But while Amalric was busy in Egypt, Nur ad-Din struck in Syria, defeating a Crusader army at the Battle of Harim and capturing most of the Frankish leaders, including the Prince of Antioch and the Count of Tripoli.
So Amalric's focus on Egypt weakened the Crusader states up north.
Definitely. There was another clash in Egypt in 1167, the indecisive Battle of Al-Babin between a Crusader Fatimid force and Shirkuh's army. Things came to a head in 1169. Both Shawar and Shirkuh died. The young Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, surprisingly appointed Saladin Shirkuh's nephew as the new vizier.
Saladin becomes vizier of Fatimid Egypt, even though he was technically working for Nur ad-Din, the Sunni ruler of Syria.
Precisely. It was a complex situation. Saladin, now in power in Cairo, consolidated his position. With reinforcements from Nur ad-Din, he decisively defeated a massive combined Crusader-Byzantine assault on the port of Damietta later in 1169. This failure marked the end of Amalric's Egyptian adventures.
Saladin's rise must have made him enemies.
Oh, yes. He quickly became a target for the assassins, who saw him as a threat. There were at least 2 attempts on his life in the mid-1170s.
Back in Jerusalem, King Amalric dies in 1174. Who succeeds him?
His young son, Baldwin IV, who tragically was diagnosed with leprosy at a young age. He became king at just 13.
The famous Leper King.
That's him. Despite his illness, he proved to be a remarkably courageous and capable ruler, often leading his armies in person. He ruled with various regents initially, and later co-ruled with his young nephew, Baldwin V.
Did Baldwin V clash with Saladin? Saladin is now consolidating power after Nur ad-Din's death, right?
Yes. Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the same year Amalric died. Saladin moved quickly to assert control over Syria, eventually taking Damascus and uniting Egypt and much of Syria under his own Ayyubid dynasty. Baldwin V, despite his youth and illness, scored a stunning victory against Saladin at the Battle of Montgessard in 1177, alongside figures like Raynald of Châtillon and the Templars. It was a major setback for Saladin early in his push against the kingdom.
But Saladin kept up the pressure.
Relentlessly. The Crusaders were defeated at Marjayun in 1179. Saladin captured and destroyed a key Crusader castle being built at Jacob's Ford later that year, slaughtering half the Templar garrison. The kingdom managed to repel Saladin's attacks at Belfort Castle in 1182 and fend off a siege at Kerak in 1183. But the pressure was immense and growing.
So the situation is becoming increasingly precarious for Jerusalem. Then Baldwin I dies.
He eventually succumbed to his leprosy in 1185. His young nephew, Baldwin V, became sole king, but he was just a child. Under the regency of Raymond III of Tripoli, Raymond actually negotiated a truce with Saladin.
But Baldwin V also died young.
Tragically, yes, died just a year later, in the summer of 1186. This plunged the kingdom into a major succession crisis.
Who took over?
Baldwin V's mother, Sibylla, engineered a coup of sorts. She had herself crowned queen, and then immediately crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as king. This faction, led by Guy and the ambitious, aggressive Raynald of Châtillon, was much more hostile towards Saladin than Raymond of Tripoli's faction had been.
So the truce with Saladin went out the window.
Pretty much. Guy and Sibylla faced an immediate, existential threat from Saladin, who was now poised to strike. Despite an earlier defeat at Al-Ful in 1183, Saladin stepped up his attacks. A provocative raid by Raynald of Châtillon against a Muslim caravan broke the truce definitively. Saladin responded by defeating a force of Templars and Hospitallers at the Battle of Cresson in May 1187.
And this leads to the decisive confrontation.
Yes, Guy of Lusignan mustered the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled. Saladin skillfully lured this massive army away from its water sources into arid terrain near the Sea of Galilee.
The Battle of Hattin, July 4th, 1187.
The defining catastrophe for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Surrounded, desperately thirsty, exhausted, the Frankish army was completely routed by Saladin's forces. Raymond of Tripoli managed to break through the lines and escape with a small contingent, an act some saw as treachery, others as survival. But most of the army was killed or captured.
Including King Guy.
Including King Guy, Raynald of Châtillon, the master of the Templars, and many other nobles. Saladin famously had Raynald of Châtillon personally executed for his provocations and breaking oaths. Guy and other high-ranking prisoners were taken captive to Damascus, though Guy was eventually released in 1188.
What happened after Hattin? Did the kingdom just collapse?
It collapsed with shocking speed, with its main army destroyed and most of its leaders dead or captured. Castle after castle, town after town fell to Saladin with little resistance throughout the summer and fall of 1187.
Including Jerusalem itself.
Yes. Saladin arrived to besiege Jerusalem on September 20, 1187. The defense was organized by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few senior nobles who had escaped Hattin. But resistance was ultimately futile. Balian negotiated the surrender of the Holy City to Saladin on October 2nd.
So after almost 90 years, Jerusalem was back in Muslim hands. How did Saladin treat the inhabitants?
Compared to the Crusader conquest in 1099, Saladin's recapture was relatively restrained. He allowed many Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave the city peacefully, although those who couldn't afford the ransom were enslaved. Churches were converted to mosques, but organized massacre was avoided. News of the fall reportedly caused Pope Urban III to die of shock or grief when he heard it.
Did any Crusader strongholds hold out?
Tyre, on the coast, became the main rallying point for refugees, under the command of the newly arrived Conrad of Montferrat. Saladin besieged Tyre in November 1187, but failed to take it, a crucial failure for him. Other major castles like Belvoir, Carac, and Montreal held out for a year or more under siege, but eventually fell. By the end of 1188, with the capture of Safed, Saladin had conquered almost the entire kingdom of Jerusalem, leaving the Franks clinging to just a few coastal cities.
The news of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem must have caused shockwaves in Europe.
Absolutely enormous shockwaves. Pope Urban III died, as you said. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a papal bull, Audita Tremendi, on October 29, 1187. It was a passionate call for Christians to aid the struggling kingdom of Jerusalem, formally launching the Third Crusade. This time, the goal was recovery, led by the most powerful monarchs in Europe.
Including the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa.
Yes. The elderly, but still formidable Emperor Frederick I, Barbarossa took the cross in March 1188. He even sent Saladin an ultimatum demanding the return of Palestine and challenging him to battle. Frederick set off with a huge German army in May 1189.
How did Barbarossa's crusade go?
He successfully navigated the challenges of crossing Byzantine territory and then marched into Asia Minor in March 1190. He won some victories against the Turks, but then disaster struck. While crossing the Salus River in Cilician Armenia in June 1190, Frederick Barbarossa drowned.
Drowned, just like that.
Just like that. A bizarre, anticlimactic end for such a major leader. His death caused chaos. Many of his disheartened German soldiers turned back home. Only a remnant, led by his son Frederick of Swabia, continued on towards the Holy Land to join the other Crusader forces.
Who were the other main leaders of the Third Crusade?
The two big rivals, Richard I, the Lionheart, newly crowned King of England, and Philip II Augustus, King of France. Richard had actually taken the crusading vow back in 1187 before he became king. He and Philip had agreed to go on crusade together.
They arrived in the Holy Land together.
Eventually, Richard had a rather eventful journey, conquering Cyprus along the way. They both arrived at the ongoing siege of Acre, which had been started by the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under Guy of Lusignan, trying to recapture the vital port city from Saladin's garrison.
Richard and Philip's arrival turned the tide at Acre.
Their arrival with fresh troops and siege equipment was crucial. After a long and grueling siege, the Muslim defenders of Acre finally surrendered on July 12, 1191. It was a major victory, but also marked by tension between Richard and Philip.
Philip left soon after.
He did, pleading ill health, but likely also eager to get back to France and potentially take advantage of Richard's absence. Philip sailed home at the end of July 1191, leaving Richard in sole command of the Crusader forces.
And Richard then committed a notorious act, the massacre of Ayadi.
Yes. Negotiations over the prisoner exchange and ransom agreed upon in the Acre surrender terms broke down. Frustrated, Richard ordered the execution of over 2,000 Muslim prisoners outside Acre on August 20, 1191. A brutal act that shocked many, even at the time. Saladin retaliated by executing Christian prisoners he held.
After Acre, Richard marched south.
Yes, heading towards Jaffa, aiming ultimately for Jerusalem. Saladin attempted to block his path, leading to the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191. It was a hard-fought battle where Richard's tactical discipline and heavy cavalry charge eventually broke Saladin's army. A significant victory for Richard, demonstrating he could defeat Saladin in open battle.
Did he take Jaffa?
Yes. Jaffa, which Saladin had held since 1187, fell to Richard 3 days after Arsuf. He then began advancing inland towards Jerusalem. Saladin, wary after Arsuf, actually disbanded much of his army for the winter in December 1191.
So Richard got close to Jerusalem.
Agonizingly close. He advanced to within about 12 miles of the city, near Beit Nuba. But then he hesitated. Concerned about supply lines, the coming winter weather, and the difficulty of actually besieging and holding Jerusalem if he took it, Richard made the controversial decision to retreat back to the coast.
He turned back when he was so close.
He did. He made another advance towards Jerusalem the following summer, in June 1192, and again came within sight of the city. But disputes within the Crusader army, particularly with the French contingent led by Hugh III of Burgundy about whether to attack Jerusalem directly or focus on Egypt, combined with the logistical challenges, forced another retreat. The army was too divided and weakened.
While Richard was wavering, Saladin struck back.
Yes. Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa in late July 1192 and actually captured the town. But Richard, hearing the news, reacted with incredible speed and boldness. He led a small force by sea, landed on the beach, and personally led the charge that drove the Muslims out of Jaffa again. Saladin's subsequent attempts to retake Jaffa failed.
So it ends in a stalemate.
Essentially, yes. Both sides were exhausted. Richard knew he needed to return to England, where his brother John was causing trouble. Saladin was also facing internal pressures. They finally negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa, signed on September 2, 1192.
What were the terms?
Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. However, the treaty guaranteed unarmed Christian pilgrims and traders safe passage to visit the holy sites. The Crusaders retained control of a narrow coastal strip from Tyre down to Jaffa. It effectively ended the Third Crusade. Richard sailed for home shortly after.
A mixed result then. Jerusalem wasn't recovered, but the Crusader presence was re-established on the coast.
Exactly. Richard achieved significant military successes, but failed in the ultimate goal. Saladin retained Jerusalem, but had been fought to a standstill and forced to concede Christian access.
Was that the end of major crusading efforts for a while?
Not quite. Just 3 years later, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, Frederick Barbarossa's son, launched the Crusade of 1197.
How did that one go?
Henry himself died unexpectedly in Messina, Sicily, on the way to the Holy Land in September 1197. However, a contingent of German nobles under his command did reach the Levant. They actually had some success, capturing the coastal stretch between Tyre and Tripoli, including the important cities of Sidon and Beirut, before news of the emperor's death prompted them to return to Germany to deal with the succession crisis there. The crusade effectively ended in July 1198.
So another short-lived effort with limited gains. What came next?
The Fourth Crusade, called by the powerful Pope Innocent III in 1198.
This one.
Well, this one went completely off the rails.
Off the rails? Wasn't the goal still Jerusalem or Egypt?
That was the initial idea. It was organized primarily by French nobles, led first by Theobald of Champagne, and after his death, by Boniface of Montferrat. They contracted with the Republic of Venice to provide transport for a huge army, maybe 30,000 crusaders, for a hefty price of 85,000 silver marks.
But the full army didn't show up in Venice.
Nowhere near. Only about half, maybe 15,000, actually arrived, which meant they couldn't pay the full amount owed to the Venetians for the ships they'd built.
Uh-oh, so the Venetians were stuck with ships and no payment.
Exactly. The shrewd, elderly Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, proposed a solution. He suggested the Crusaders could pay off their debt by helping Venice recapture the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the crusading vow.
Attacking a Christian city. On a crusade, how did the Pope react?
Pope Innocent III was horrified, at least officially. He forbade the attack and excommunicated the participants after it happened. But his role is debated. He condemned it, withdrew his legate, but ultimately seemed to accept it. Some historians argue his priority became keeping the crusade movement alive, even if diverted. Others think Venice basically hijacked the crusade for its own ends. Zara fell to the Crusaders and Venetians in late 1202.
And then things got even more complicated.
Much more complicated. While wintering in Zara, the Crusade leaders were approached by envoys of a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos. His father, Emperor Isaac II Angelos, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother, who was now Emperor Alexios III. The young Alexios proposed the deal.
What was the deal?
If the Crusaders helped him overthrow his uncle Alexios III and install him and his blind father back on the Byzantine throne in Constantinople, he promised them a huge sum of money, 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 Byzantine troops for the crusade to Egypt, provisions for their army, and crucially, the reunion of the Greek Orthodox Church with Rome under papal authority.
A very tempting offer. Did they take it?
Despite papal opposition and unease among some crusaders, the leadership, heavily influenced by the Venetians, who saw opportunities for trade advantages, and figures like Boniface of Montferrat, agreed. In 1203, the Crusader fleet sailed not for Egypt, but for Constantinople.
And they actually managed to overthrow Alexios III.
Surprisingly easily, yes. Alexios III fled the city, and young Alexios IV, alongside his blind father Isaac II, was installed as co-emperor.
Yeah.
But Alexios I quickly discovered he couldn't actually fulfill his extravagant promises to the Crusaders. The Byzantine treasury was empty, and the Greek populace and clergy were deeply hostile to the Latins and the idea of submitting to the Pope.
So the Crusaders were stuck in Constantinople, waiting for payment that wasn't coming.
Exactly. Tensions escalated. Alexios IV, reliant on the Crusaders for support but facing growing Greek resistance, became increasingly desperate. In early 1204, there was an anti-Latin revolt in Constantinople. Alexios V was overthrown and murdered by a powerful court official, Alexios Ducas, known as Murtzouphlos, who became Emperor Alexios V.
And Alexios V told the Crusaders to get lost.
Pretty much. The Crusaders now found themselves in a perilous situation. Their ships weren't really seaworthy for a long voyage, they lacked supplies, they had no money, and the city was now hostile. Their only viable option, as they saw it, was to take the city by force and seize the wealth they believed they were owed.
So they attacked Constantinople, their supposed allies.
They did. In April 1204, after a fierce assault, the Crusader and Venetian forces breached the massive seawalls of Constantinople. What followed was the infamous sack of Constantinople.
How bad was it?
3 days of horrific pillaging, looting, and destruction. Churches and monasteries were desecrated, precious relics stolen, priceless artworks destroyed or melted down, and countless Greek Orthodox Christian inhabitants were killed or brutalized. It was seen as an absolute atrocity, even by many contemporaries like Pope Innocent III and Muslim historians like Ali ibn al-Athir. It created a wound between Eastern and Western Christianity that arguably never fully healed.
And instead of going to the Holy Land, the Fourth Crusade ended up conquering the Christian Byzantine Empire.
Yes. They dismembered the empire, establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with Baldwin of Flanders chosen as the first Latin emperor, and partitioning territories among Venice and the Crusader lords. It was a bizarre and tragic outcome, completely diverting the crusade from its original purpose and deeply damaging the cause in the long run.
Wow. Okay, so after that debacle, did crusading stop?
Not entirely, but the Fourth Crusade definitely cast a long shadow. Pope Innocent III, despite his dismay over Constantinople, was determined to get a crusade back on track towards his proper goal. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, he called for a new major expedition, the Fifth Crusade.
What was the plan this time? Back to the original idea of attacking Egypt first.
Exactly. The strategy was to conquer Egypt, the center of Ayyubid power, now ruled by Sultan al-Adil, Saladin's brother, as a base to then recover Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Innocent III died in 1216, but his successor, Honorius III, pushed the plan forward, urging Emperor Frederick II of Germany, who had taken the cross in 1215, and King Andrew II of Hungary to lead it.
Did they? Frederick II was known for delaying.
He certainly delayed. But Andrew II of Hungary did set out, arriving in Acre in August 1217, joining forces with John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem, who held the title largely through marriage. Their initial campaign in Syria achieved very little, and Andrew went back to Hungary early in 1118.
So who led the main attack on Egypt?
The remaining commanders, including John of Brienne and the masters of the military orders, decided to proceed with the attack on the key Egyptian port city of Damietta, even without Frederick II. The siege began in June 1218.
Damietta was heavily fortified.
Very. A key defense was a massive chain stretched across the Nile, anchored by a formidable tower, the Burj al-Silsila. The Crusaders managed a daring assault and captured this chain tower after weeks of effort. Its loss was a huge shock to the Ayyubids. Sultan al-Adil reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news, succeeded by his son al-Kamil.
Did the Crusaders press their advantage?
They paused, waiting for reinforcements, including a large contingent led by the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius Galvani, who arrived with a somewhat uncompromising attitude. By February 1219, the Crusaders had Damietta fully surrounded.
Did the new Sultan al-Kamil try to negotiate?
He did. Recognizing the danger, al-Kamil made a remarkable offer. He would surrender the entire kingdom of Jerusalem, except for a couple of key fortresses in Transjordan, back to the Crusaders if they would just evacuate Egypt.
Wow. Jerusalem offered back on a plate? Did they accept?
Incredibly, no. John of Brienne and the secular leaders were strongly in favor of accepting the deal it achieved their ultimate goal. But Cardinal Pelagius, supported by the Italian contingents and the military orders, flatly refused. He distrusted al-Kamil and was perhaps overconfident after capturing the chain tower, believing they could conquer all of Egypt.
A massive missed opportunity. Francis of Assisi even tried to intervene.
A huge missed opportunity, many historians argue. And yes, St. Francis of Assisi famously crossed the battle lines during a truce and attempted to negotiate peace directly with Sultan al-Kamil, hoping to convert him. It was a courageous act, but ultimately unsuccessful diplomatically.
So the siege continued.
Yes. The Crusaders finally entered Damietta in November 1219, only to find the city largely abandoned and devastated by famine and disease. Al-Kamil had withdrawn his forces further south to Mansoura. Pelagius struggled to maintain momentum. Many Crusaders, feeling their vows fulfilled by taking Damietta, went home. Al-Kamil, meanwhile, reinforced Mansoura and renewed his peace offer, offering Jerusalem again. Again, Pelagius rejected it. Emperor Frederick II sent troops, but ordered them to wait for his own arrival.
What happened next? Did they advance from Damietta?
Against the advice of John of Brienne and other experienced commanders, Pelagius ordered an advance south towards Cairo in July 1221. They reached Mansoura in late August.
And walked into a trap.
Essentially, Al-Kamil waited until the Crusaders were camped in a vulnerable position between branches of the Nile during the annual flood season. Then, he opened the sluice gates upstream, flooding the area around the Crusader camp, cutting off their retreat and supply lines.
Surrounded and flooded.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Trapped, starving, and unable to maneuver, Pelagius had no choice but to surrender.
What were the surrender terms this time?
Humiliating. The Crusaders had to agree to withdraw completely from Damietta and all of Egypt, observe an 8-year truce, release all their prisoners, and return a relic believed to be the true cross, which it turned out Al-Kamil didn't actually possess. In return, they were granted safe passage out of Egypt. Hostages were exchanged, John of Brienne for the Franks, Al-Kamil's son for the Egyptians. The Fifth Crusade ended in total failure in September 1221, achieving absolutely nothing.
Another disaster, mainly due to bad leadership and rejecting peace offers.
That's certainly a major interpretation. Pelagius's intransigence and overconfidence played a huge role.
So after the Fifth Crusade's failure, the pressure was really on Emperor Frederick II to actually go on crusade.
Immense pressure. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe. He'd taken the vow years ago. Popes Honorius III and his successor Gregory VI pushed him relentlessly. Frederick even signed an agreement at San Germano in 1225, promising under oath to depart by August 1227, maintain troops in Syria for 2 years, and deposit a huge sum of money in escrow, which he'd forfeit if he failed to go.
Did he also become King of Jerusalem?
Yes, through marriage. In 1225, he married Isabella II, the young heiress to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, John of Brienne's daughter. He immediately claimed the kingship in her name, sidelining his father-in-law John.
Did Frederick finally set off in 1227?
He assembled a fleet and actually set sail from Brindisi in September 1227. But almost immediately, an outbreak of plague struck the fleet. Frederick himself fell ill, disembarked to recover, and sent the rest of the fleet onto Acre.
How did the Pope react to this delay?
Pope Gregory VI was furious. Believing Frederick was making excuses again, he promptly excommunicated the emperor on September 29, 1227, for failing to fulfill his crusading oath.
Excommunicated. But Frederick went anyway.
Yes. Despite the excommunication and failed attempts at reconciliation with the Pope, Frederick recovered his health and sailed again from Brindisi in June 1228, arriving in Acre in September. He was actually warmly received by many of the local barons and the military orders, despite his status as an excommunicated.
Yeah, so the Sixth Crusade was led by an excommunicated emperor. How did that work?
It was unique. Frederick arrived with a relatively small army. He couldn't afford a long military campaign, partly because the Pope had launched a war against Frederick's territories in Italy, the War of the Keys, in his absence. So Frederick realized his best bet was negotiation, not large-scale warfare.
Negotiation with Sultan Al-Kamil, the same sultan from the Fifth Crusade.
The very same. Al-Kamil's own political situation had shifted. He was involved in conflicts with his relatives, particularly his brother Al-Muazzam in Damascus. Although Al-Muazzam died shortly before Frederick arrived, Al-Kamil still faced potential rivals and perhaps saw a temporary truce with Frederick as politically advantageous.
So they struck a deal. An excommunicated Christian emperor and a Muslim sultan.
They did, for reasons that are still debated by historians, maybe mutual respect, maybe shared intellectual interests, maybe pure political calculation. They reached an agreement. The Treaty of Jaffa was concluded in February 18, 1229.
And what were the terms of this treaty?
Astonishingly, Al-Kamil agreed to surrender Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor of land connecting Jerusalem to the coast back to Christian control. He stipulated that the Temple Mount area of Jerusalem, Haram al-Sharif, sacred to Muslims, would remain under Muslim administration, and the city walls, which had been dismantled, were not to be rebuilt. The treaty also included a 10-year truce between Frederick and the Ayyubids.
Frederick got Jerusalem back through diplomacy, without a major battle.
Exactly. He marched into Jerusalem on March 17, 1229, received the formal surrender from Al-Kamil's representatives, and the next day, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he placed the crown of Jerusalem on his own head, a controversial act given his excommunication.
How was this received?
Very mixed reactions. Frederick himself was triumphant. He had achieved what previous crusades had failed to do, and without papal blessing or significant bloodshed. Many in the West were amazed, but hardliners in both the Christian and Muslim camps were appalled. The Patriarch of Jerusalem placed the city under interdict because it had been recovered by an excommunicate. Many Muslims saw Al-Kamil's treaty as a betrayal, a shameful surrender of the Holy City.
Frederick didn't stay long.
No. Facing hostility from the clergy and parts of the nobility and needing to deal with the Pope's war back in Italy, he left Acre on May 1st, 1229. He eventually negotiated an end to his excommunication with Pope Gregory IX through the Treaty of Sobrano in August 1230.
So the Sixth Crusade, uniquely successful but deeply controversial.
Absolutely. It would turn Jerusalem to Christian rule for over a decade, achieved through diplomacy by an excommunicated leader, setting a precedent completely outside papal control. A truly fascinating episode.
What happened when that 10-year truce between Frederick and Al-Kamil expired around 1239?
Pope Gregory IX, who still condemned the truce, had already called for a new crusade back in 1234 with the bull Rachel Sum Videns. Nobles in England and France took the cross, but their departure was delayed, partly because Frederick II, still technically King of Jerusalem, opposed any crusading before the truce officially ended. Frederick himself got excommunicated again in 1239, so most of the new crusaders avoided his lands.
So who led this new wave, often called the Barons' Crusade?
It wasn't one unified crusade, but two major expeditions arriving separately. The first, primarily French, was led by Theobald I, King of Navarre, who was also a famous poet, and Hugh, Duke of Burgundy. They arrived in Acre in September 1239.
And walked into another Ayyubid civil war.
Pretty much. Sultan Al-Kamil had died in 1238, and his sons and relatives were fighting for control. Al-Kamil's brother, as-Salih Ismail, seized Damascus from his nephew, as-Salih Ayyub, who eventually became Sultan of Egypt. It was a complex mess.
How did Theobald navigate this?
He initially decided to march south from Acre towards Jaffa, planning to refortify Ascalon and maybe move against Egypt later. But during the march, some of the more impetuous French knights, against Theobald's orders and the advice of the military orders, launched a premature attack on an Egyptian force near Gaza.
And got defeated.
Devastatingly defeated. A major setback right at the start. The military orders persuaded Theobald to retreat back to Acre. About a month later, another Ayyubid ruler, Nasir Dakud of Kerak, took advantage of the chaos and seized Jerusalem, which was largely undefended.
So Jerusalem was lost again, briefly.
Very briefly. But the ongoing Ayyubid infighting actually allowed Theobald to play diplomat. He managed to negotiate with as-Salih Ismail of Damascus, who was rivals with Nasir Daud. Ismail agreed to restore Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and much of Galilee to the Crusaders in return for their support against Egypt. Having secured this, Theobald considered his crusade a success and departed for Europe in September 1240.
Then the English contingent arrived.
Yes, led by Richard of Cornwall, brother of King Henry III of England. He arrived in Acre in October 1240. Richard, known for his wealth and diplomatic skills, marched to Jaffa and basically confirmed and solidified the territorial gains negotiated by Theobald, this time making a formal treaty with as-Salih Ayyub of Egypt, who was now allied with Nasir Daud against Ismail. It's incredibly confusing, all the shifting alliances.
So Richard confirmed the return of Jerusalem and other territories?
Yes, the agreement was ratified in February 1241. Prisoners were released. Richard also helped finish the refortification of Ascalon, entrusting it to an imperial representative loyal to Frederick II before heading home in May 1241.
Was there another part to this crusade involving Constantinople?
Sort of. Baldwin of Courtenay, the Latin emperor of Constantinople, traveled west seeking aid. He returned east around the same time as Theobald, was crowned emperor in 1240, and launched a minor crusade, capturing a Nicaean stronghold called Jerusalem. It's sometimes lumped in with the Barons' Crusade.
So, territorially, the Barons' Crusade was quite successful. The kingdom regained a lot of land.
Surprisingly successful, yes. In terms of territory recovered through diplomacy, it was arguably the most successful crusade since the first. The Kingdom of Jerusalem reached its largest extent since before Hattin in 1187.
But the gains didn't last.
Tragically, no. The Ayyubid rivalries that allowed the Franks to play diplomat soon subsided, and a new, destructive force entered the region, the Khwarezmians.
Who were they?
Remnants of a Central Asian empire displaced by the Mongols, as Salih Ayyub of Egypt actually hired them as mercenaries. In 1244, a large Khwarezmian army swept down through Syria and Palestine. They besieged Jerusalem in July 1244.
And Jerusalem fell again, this time for good.
Yes. The city's defenses were still weak, the garrison small. The Khwarezmians stormed the city, sacked it brutally, massacred thousands of Christians, and effectively destroyed Jerusalem as a functioning city. This was the final loss of Jerusalem for the Crusaders.
And it got worse?
Much worse. The combined Frankish forces of the kingdom, allied with their former enemies from Damascus and Kerak, confronted the Egyptian army and their Khwarezmian allies at the Battle of Laforbi near Gaza, few months later in October 1244. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Franks. Their army was virtually annihilated. Lafourbe permanently crippled Christian military power in the Holy Land.
The sack of Jerusalem and the disaster at Lafourbe, this leads to another crusade.
Yes. News of these devastating setbacks prompted King Louis IX of France, later known as Saint Louis, to organize the Seventh Crusade.
Louis IX himself was very devout, wasn't he?
Extremely devout. He had apparently fallen gravely ill with malaria around the end of 1244 and vowed to take the cross if he recovered, which he did. Pope Innocent V formally preached the Crusade at the First Council of Lyon in 1245, though the Pope was also preoccupied with his ongoing conflict with Emperor Frederick II, whom he declared deposed at the same council.
So Louis IX led this one personally. Was the objective Egypt again?
Yes, Louis led it, and the objective was again Egypt, seen as the heart of Muslim power under Sultan Asl Ayyub, Al-Kamil's son. Louis spent years meticulously planning and financing the expedition. He finally set off from Paris in August 1248, accompanied by his queen, his brothers Charles of Anjou and Robert of Artois, and many prominent French nobles, including the chronicler Jean de Joinville.
Where did they go first?
Their first stop was Cyprus, where they wintered from September 1248, waiting for all their forces to assemble. They were joined there by contingents from Acre, including the Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers. Egypt was confirmed as the target, remembering Al-Kamil's old offer to trade Damietta for Jerusalem. Louis, however, was apparently unwilling to negotiate with Muslims and even tried, unsuccessfully, to forge an alliance with the Mongols against them.
How did the landing in Egypt go? Did they target Damietta again?
Yes, Damietta again. Sultan Salih Ayyub was actually campaigning in Syria, expecting the Crusaders to land there. He rushed back to Cairo, ordering Damietta to be fortified. The Crusader fleet arrived off Damietta on June 5, 1249. Louis IX himself reportedly leaped into the water in full armor to lead the landing. After a short, fierce battle on the beach, the Egyptian commander panicked and evacuated the city.
So they took Damietta quite easily.
Surprisingly easily, yes. With only one reported Crusader casualty, Damietta became a Frankish base. Louis then made a crucial, perhaps fateful, decision: to wait for the annual Nile floods to subside before advancing further inland. He also waited for his other brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, to arrive with reinforcements.
Did the Sultan try to negotiate this time? Offer Jerusalem again?
As Salih Ayyub, shocked by the loss of Damietta, did indeed offer to trade it for Jerusalem. But Louis IX, perhaps remembering the Fifth Crusade's rejection or simply unwilling on principle, refused the offer.
So they waited in Damietta for months?
Yes, until late October 1249. Then, with the Nile receding and reinforcements arrived, the Frankish army finally began its advance toward Mansoura, where the main Egyptian army was waiting.
What happened with the Sultan?
Sultan Salih Ayyub actually died in November 1249 during the Crusader advance. His formidable wife, Shajar al-Dur, concealed his death to prevent panic. She secretly forged documents appointing his absent son, Muazzam Turanshah, who was in Syria, as heir, and keeping the army command structure in place. A remarkable feat of political maneuvering in the midst of a crisis.
The Crusaders didn't know the Sultan was dead.
Not initially. They reached Mansoura in December 1249 and found themselves facing the Egyptian army across a canal. They were stuck there for about 6 weeks.
How did they break the stalemate?
They eventually found a way across the canal further downstream. In February 1250, Louis ordered a risky dawn attack on the Egyptian camp, led by his impulsive brother Robert of Artois and the Templars.
The Battle of Mansoura.
Yes. The initial charge was successful, scattering the surprised Egyptians. But Robert of Artois, against orders, recklessly pursued the fleeing enemy right into the narrow streets of Mansoura itself. There, his force was trapped, surrounded, and virtually wiped out. Robert himself was killed, along with the English commander William Longspay and hundreds of knights, including almost all the Templars who charged with him.
A victory turned into a disaster.
A Pyrrhic victory at best for Louis, who managed to secure the Egyptian camp but lost a huge portion of his elite troops. The Egyptians, now commanded by the Mamluk general Babars al-Buntukari, the future Sultan Baybars, regrouped and launched fierce counterattacks on February 11th. The fighting was intense. The Templar Grand Master was killed. The Hospitaller Master died later of wounds. Louis's other brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, was surrounded but rescued. The battle ended indecisively at nightfall.
What happened then? Did the new Sultan arrive?
Yes. Turanshah finally arrived from Syria at the end of February 1250. He took command and launched a more coordinated Egyptian offensive. Crucially, Egyptian ships managed to intercept the Crusader supply boats coming down the Nile from Damietta.
Cutting off their food supply.
Exactly. The Frankish army, already weakened and now trapped deep in enemy territory, began to suffer badly from famine and disease. Scurvy and dysentery were rampant. Louis IX himself fell ill. Realizing the situation was hopeless, he ordered a retreat back towards Damietta on April 5th, 1250.
Did he make it?
No. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. The Egyptians pursued relentlessly. At the Battle of Feriskar on April 6th, the exhausted and demoralized Crusader army was surrounded and overwhelmed. King Louis IX, sick and barely able to stand, was captured along with most of his surviving army.
The King of France captured, another massive disaster.
A complete catastrophe. The Egyptians were almost unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners. Many of the sick and wounded were executed immediately. Louis and his senior commanders were taken to Mansoura.
How did Louis get released? Ransom.
Yes, lengthy negotiations began. The initial terms were harsh. Louis had to ransom himself by surrendering Damietta, and ransom his army by paying a huge sum initially, 1,000,000 bezants, later reduced to 800,000, though only half was ever paid. While Louis was finalizing the ransom, another dramatic event occurred.
What was that?
Sultan Turanshah, who had only ruled for a few months, was murdered in a coup orchestrated by the Mamluk emirs with the connivance of his stepmother, Shajar al-Dur. Power in Egypt effectively passed to the Mamluks.
So Louis negotiated his release with the Mamluks.
Yes, the deal held. Damietta was handed back to the Egyptians on May 6, 1250. Louis and the remnants of his army were released. Tragically, many wounded soldiers left behind in Damietta were reportedly massacred. News of the king's capture even sparked a spontaneous, ill-fated popular movement in France called the Shepherd's Crusade in 1251, hoping to free him.
Where did Louis go after his release? Did he go straight home?
No. Instead of returning to France immediately, Louis sailed to Acre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He actually remained in the Holy Land for 4 more years, until 1254.
Doing what? Trying to salvage something?
Basically, yes. He spent his time and considerable resources refortifying key coastal cities like Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon. He tried to mediate disputes among the local Frankish factions and engaged in diplomacy, including further, ultimately fruitless, attempts to ally with the Mongols. His presence helped stabilize the drastically weakened Crusader states for a time. His departure in 1254 is generally considered the end of the Seventh Crusade.
So, after Louis IX left in 1254, what was the situation? The Crusader states were just clinging to the coast.
Pretty much.
Oh.
Weakened, demoralized, and increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, in Egypt, there was a power struggle among the Mamluk leaders following the overthrow of the Ayyubids. But a new, even greater threat was emerging from the east: the Mongols.
The Mongols were pushing west, towards Syria.
This external threat actually forced the Mamluks in Egypt to unite. A Mamluk leader named Qutuz seized the Sultanate in 1259. He then made a crucial, temporary alliance with his rival, the brilliant General Baibars, the same Baibars who had fought Louis IX at Mansoura. Together, they confronted the Mongol army.
At the Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260.
Exactly. A hugely significant battle. The Mamluks decisively defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in Palestine. This victory halted the seemingly unstoppable Mongol advance westward and saved Egypt and potentially North Africa and even Europe from Mongol conquest. It also massively boosted Mamluk prestige.
And Baibars took power soon after.
Yes. Qutuz was assassinated shortly after Ain Jalut, almost certainly by Baibars, or with his complicity. Baibars then became Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and he proved to be a relentless and highly effective enemy of the remaining Crusader states.
Baibars launched major campaigns against the Franks.
Systematically between 1265 and 1271, his goal seemed to be the complete eradication of the Frankish presence. He captured major cities and fortresses one by one: Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed. He conducted brutal sieges and often massacred the defenders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers. His most significant conquest was the capture and destruction of the great city of Antioch in 1268, ending the oldest Crusader state.
Why was Baibars so successful?
He was a brilliant military commander and strategist. He understood the importance of logistics, siege warfare, and intelligence. He also exploited the divisions among the Franks, like the ongoing rivalry between Venice and Genoa, the War of St. Sabas, which weakened Acre. He also skillfully played diplomacy, preventing a unified Latin-Mongol alliance against him and maintaining routes for recruiting new Mamluk soldiers from the north.
Did the West try to respond to Baibars' aggression? Was there another crusade?
Yes. King Louis IX of France, despite the disaster of his first crusade, decided to lead another one, the Eighth Crusade in 1270.
Back to Egypt? Or the Holy Land?
Neither, actually. Influenced, it seems, by his ambitious brother, Charles of Anjou, who is now king of Sicily and had his own designs on the Mediterranean, Louis IX directed the crusade against Tunis in North Africa. The official justifications were flimsy, perhaps converting the emir of Tunis or disrupting piracy, but Charles certainly stood to benefit from controlling Tunis.
How did the Eighth Crusade go?
It was another disaster, even quicker than the last one. Soon after landing near Tunis in the summer heat of 1270, disease swept through the Crusader camp, dysentery most likely. King Louis IX himself fell ill and died on August 25th. His death effectively ended the crusade before it really began. The fleet returned to France.
Was there anyone else involved? Prince Edward of England?
Yes, Prince Edward of England, the future King Edward I, arrived in Tunis with his contingent just too late to join Louis. Hearing of the king's death, Edward decided to continue on to the Holy Land with his small force. This is sometimes called the Lord Edward's Crusade, or the Ninth Crusade.
Did Edward achieve anything in Acre?
He arrived in Acre in 1271, causing some alarm for Baibars, who paused his campaigns briefly. Edward achieved very little militarily, survived an assassination attempt, possibly arranged by Baibars, but did manage to negotiate a 10-year truce between the Kingdom of Jerusalem, now reduced basically to Acre and its surroundings, and the Mamluks. He then returned to England in 1272 to become king. His was really the last significant crusading expedition from Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean.
So after 1272, the remaining Crusader outposts were living on borrowed time, under truce, but facing the Mamluks alone.
Essentially, yes. There were numerous plans and proposals for new crusades floated in Europe over the next 2 decades by Pope Gregory X, by Charles of Anjou, by Pope Nicholas V, but none ever materialized into a major expedition. The political will, the unity, and perhaps the resources just weren't there anymore in the West.
Who were the main players trying to resist the Mamluks locally?
Really just the kings of Cyprus, who also claimed the title King of Jerusalem, the remaining military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, the Italian merchant colonies in Acre, and occasional, usually unsuccessful attempts at coordination with the Mongol Ilkhanate based in Persia. But they were hopelessly outmatched by the unified Mamluk Sultanate.
How did the end finally come?
The Mamluks, under Sultan Qalawun and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil, resumed their offensive once the truces expired. Tripoli, the last remnant of the county of Tripoli, fell in 1289 after a brutal siege. The final act came in 1291.
The Siege of Acre.
Yes. Al-Ashraf Khalil brought a massive Mamluk army and siege train against Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold and capital of the remnant kingdom. After a desperate 6-week siege, the city fell on May 18, 1291. The fighting was fierce, the sack was brutal, and most of the defenders and inhabitants were killed or enslaved.
A devastating end. Did any Christian presence remain?
After Acre fell, the remaining coastal towns, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, surrendered or were abandoned without a fight. The Templars held out on the small island of Ruad just off the coast near Tortosa for another decade, but that too fell to the Mamluks in 1302. That marked the definitive end of the Crusader states on the mainland Levant.
So by the early 14th century, the whole Crusader enterprise in the Holy Land was over.
Essentially, yes. There were still proposals for crusades to liberate Jerusalem, but the focus of Western crusading efforts shifted. The Knights Hospitaller conquered the Byzantine island of Rhodes and made that their base for centuries. The Knights Templar were controversially suppressed and disbanded by King Philip V of France and the Pope starting in 1307. The Mongols in Persia eventually converted to Islam, removing them as potential allies. The Mamluk Sultanate remained the dominant power in the region for another couple of centuries until the Ottoman conquest. The era of large-scale crusades aimed at recovering Jerusalem was well and truly over.
It's fascinating how the idea of crusading, born out of that desire to recover the Holy Land, got applied elsewhere too, like the Reconquista in Spain.
Absolutely. The popes explicitly linked the fight against the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula with the Crusades to Jerusalem very early on. Urban II did it. Crusades were preached for Spain in 1114 and 1118. Pope Calixtus II even proposed fighting on both fronts in 1122.
And during the Second Crusade, the campaigns in Spain were officially sanctioned.
Yes. Pope Eugene III authorized that expansion in 1147, equating campaigns against the Moors with the Holy Land effort. And as we mentioned, that led to successes like the capture of Lisbon and Tortosa, partly with the help of Northern European crusaders who stopped off on their way east, or west in Lisbon's case.
Was the Reconquista very different in character from the Holy Land Crusades?
In some ways. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Spanish Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, were powerful enough to conquer significant territory on their own. They sometimes got foreign crusader help, like at the crucial Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. But many foreign crusaders apparently deserted because they were uncomfortable with the Spanish tolerance shown towards defeated Muslims. The Reconquista was often more about political domination and colonization than outright extermination or expulsion, at least until the very end.
Though they did impose Catholicism.
Oh yes. The Roman Rite was relentlessly imposed on the Moslems, the native Christians who had lived under Muslim rule, absorbing them into mainstream Catholicism. The process culminated, of course, in 1492 with the final surrender of the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim state in Iberia.
What about the Northern Crusades? Against pagans in the Baltic region?
That's another major theater. Again, Pope Eugene III authorized a crusade against the pagan Wends on the northeast German frontier in 1147, concurrent with the Second Crusade. This was often driven as much by German lords' desire for land and economic expansion as by religious conversion.
Did the military orders get involved there too?
Heavily, especially from the early 13th century. You had the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, the Order of Dobes, but the dominant force became the Teutonic Knights. They shifted their main focus from the Holy Land to the Baltic, absorbed those other orders, and carved out their own powerful state, the state of the Teutonic Order, which eventually evolved into Prussia. These crusades continued well into the 15th century.
And then there were crusades against other Christians. That seems like a stretch of the original idea.
It does, but it happened, increasingly so, from the early 13th century. Initially, popes were hesitant to use the full crusading apparatus, indulgences, vows, privileges against political opponents or heretics within Christendom, but Pope Innocent III changed that.
With the Albigensian Crusade.
Exactly. Launched in 1209 against the Cathar heresy in southern France, Languedoc. While it ultimately failed to completely stamp out Catharism immediately, it devastated the region culturally and economically, and importantly, it set a precedent. If you could have a crusade against heretics, why not other papal enemies?
So it expanded from there.
Yes. Pressure on Milan for tolerating Cathars. Crusades against rebellious peasants in Germany, the Stedinger. Against alleged heretics in Bosnia. Norman Housley, a major historian of the later Crusades, notes this link between perceived heresy and anti-papal political stances, particularly in Italy. Indulgences were offered for fighting heretics. Innocent III even declared the first explicitly political crusade against Markwart von Anweiler, a regent challenging papal interests in Sicily.
And popes used it against Emperor Frederick II later on.
Yes, Pope Gregory the Dex used crusading rhetoric and offered indulgences for fighting Frederick II in the 1240s. After Frederick's death, the focus shifted to Sicily again, with Pope Urban V offering full crusade privileges to Charles of Anjou to conquer the island from Frederick's heirs in the 1260s.
These political crusades sound messy. Did they have clear goals like Jerusalem?
Often not. They lacked clear objectives, geographical limits. They became tools of papal foreign policy. When a French Pope, Martin IV, was elected in 1281, he fully backed Charles of Anjou's ambitions, even sanctioning a crusade against the Byzantine Empire again. Though that was thwarted by the Sicilian Vespers uprising, secretly backed by the Byzantines and Peter III of Aragon.
So crusades against Aragon too?
Yes, Peter III was excommunicated, and an unsuccessful Aragonese crusade was launched against him. Political crusading continued against Venice, against Emperor Louis V of Germany, even against mercenary companies causing trouble in Italy. It really diluted the original concept.
What about those popular, unsanctioned uprisings, like the Children's Crusade?
Those were tragic episodes, often emerging from waves of popular piety and frustration when official crusades failed. The Shepherd's Crusades, there were two, in 1251 and 1320, and the supposed Children's Crusade of 1212. These were largely spontaneous, ill-fated movements of the poor and marginalized, often ending in disaster, exploitation, or suppression.
Were there major crusades in the 14th century?
After the fall of Acre, there were quite a few, though often smaller scale or directed at different targets. Crusades against heretical groups like the Dulcinians, popular uprisings like the Crusade of the Poor, campaigns against the Catalan Company in Greece, the Shepherd's Crusade of 1320, naval crusades like the Smyrniote Crusades against Turkish pirates, crusades against Orthodox Novgorod by the Swedes, the Savoyard Crusade aimed at helping Byzantium, the sack of Alexandria in 1365, crusades against North African ports like Mahdia, and crucially, the build-up to major efforts against the rising Ottoman Turks.
Ah, the Ottomans. They become the new focus.
Increasingly, yes, especially in the late 14th and 15th centuries. The Ottomans defeated the Serbs at Kosovo in 1389, expanding rapidly into the Balkans. This prompted major Western responses, like the disastrous Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, where a large French and Hungarian army was crushed.
And the Ottomans kept winning.
Often, yes. They destroyed another Crusader army at Varna in 1444, defeated the Hungarians again at Kosovo in 1448, and the ultimate blow came in 1453 with the capture of Constantinople, finally ending the Byzantine Empire.
Did crusading continue after Constantinople fell?
There were calls for crusades and some efforts, but the political landscape was changing. The 16th century saw complex alliances, sometimes Christian powers like France allied with the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against other Christian powers like the Habsburgs. The rise of the Reformation also fractured Christian unity, making large-scale pan-European crusades almost impossible.
Did crusading against fellow Christians decline?
Mostly, yes, by the 15th century. There were the failed Hussite crusades against reformers in Bohemia and attacks on Waldensian heretics, but the focus shifted. Crusading often became more of a financial exercise. Popes would authorize the collection of crusade taxes for various purposes, not always military. Political and commercial goals often outweighed religious ones. The direct Ottoman threat eventually diminished after major defeats, like the Siege of Vienna in 1683, and by the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, anti-Ottoman crusading was largely obsolete. The idea itself faded.
Let's step back and think about the whole crusading movement. What was the underlying religious mechanism? How did the church justify and motivate people?
It builds on developments in the Latin Church before the 11th century regarding sin and penance. You had the idea of contrition, confession, telling a priest, and penance, doing acts to make amends. But for the warrior aristocracy, making proper reparation for sins, especially violent ones, was difficult.
So the crusade offered a solution.
A revolutionary one. Pope Gregory VII started offering absolution forgiveness for violence committed in the service of the church, if done selflessly. His successors developed this into the concept of the plenary indulgence.
Plenary indulgence, meaning?
The idea that participating in a crusade, under the right conditions, taking the vow, genuine repentance, could remit all the temporal penalties imposed by God for confessed sins. Not a license to the sin, theoretically, but a way to wipe the slate clean through this extraordinary act of devotion and service. It was an incredibly powerful motivator.
And this tied into broader papal ambitions.
Definitely. The papacy, especially during the Gregorian reform movement, was developing what scholars call political Augustinianism. This was an ideology aimed at freeing the church from secular control, asserting its supremacy over kings and emperors, and even over the Orthodox Church in the East. Part of this was the idea that the church had a duty to actively intervene in the world to impose justice, as defined by the church.
So crusading fit perfectly into that worldview.
Perfectly. The church developed a specific ideology to promote and regulate crusading. It drew on Old Testament stories of Israelite holy wars, blended with New Testament ideas. Holy war against pagans or Muslims was justified because they opposed Christianity. The Holy Land was seen as Christ's patrimony, unjustly held, and recovering it was acting on God's behalf.
And this applied to other crusades too.
Yes. The Albigensian Crusade was framed as defending the French Church. The Northern Crusades were about conquering lands for Christianity. This ideology, inspired by the success of the First Crusade, became deeply ingrained in late medieval Western culture and profoundly impacted the Western Islamic world too. Christendom wasn't just a religious concept, it was geopolitical, and crusading was a key part of its practice and identity for centuries.
When did this ideology start to fade?
It declined significantly after the Reformation shattered Western Christian unity. The ideology persisted in some forms, especially with the military orders. But the rise of nation-states, other religious wars, and new political philosophies gradually pushed it to the margins by the 17th century.
You mentioned the military orders several times. Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, they were a unique feature of the Crusades, weren't they?
Absolutely unique. Religious orders founded in the early 12th century, whose members took monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, but were also knights dedicated to defending Christians and the Holy Land.
What were the main ones?
The Knights Hospitaller, Order of St. John, actually started with a medical mission in Jerusalem, even before the First Crusade, but quickly evolved into a formidable military force. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119, specifically to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. And the Teutonic Knights formed around 1190, initially to help German pilgrims, but their focus soon shifted to the Baltic region.
How did they become so powerful?
They received strong papal backing and huge donations of land and money from across Europe. This gave them a steady flow of recruits and wealth, independent of local lords or kings. They built massive castles, maintained permanent garrisons, and developed into autonomous supranational organizations, major powers in their own right within the Crusader states.
What happened to them after the fall of Acre?
The Hospitallers relocated first to Cyprus, then conquered Rhodes, and ruled it until the Ottomans took it in 1522, eventually ending up in Malta. The Templars, as we discussed, were controversially suppressed in the early 14th century, accused of heresy largely for political and financial reasons by Philip IV of France. The Teutonic Knights continued their campaigns in Prussia and the Baltic well into the 15th century, before eventually secularizing.
Did the Crusades have a big impact on art and architecture? Did Crusaders bring back new styles?
It's complex. The historian Joshua Prower noted that remarkably few major European intellectuals or artists actually settled permanently in the Crusader states. People went on pilgrimage, yes, and that influenced Western poetry and art, encouraging more pilgrimage. But the direct artistic flow wasn't always huge.
What about military architecture? Did the West learn castle building from the East?
That used to be the common idea, but modern historians largely reject it. Europe already had sophisticated castle-building traditions. What we see in the Crusader castles like Crac de Chevalier is more of a synthesis. They certainly adapted to local conditions and encountered Byzantine and Muslim fortifications, which influenced specific features like massive water cisterns becoming crucial, whereas moats, common in Europe, were less practical in the arid East. But it wasn't a simple case of learning everything from scratch. Crusader castles are maybe the most original and impressive artistic architectural legacy of the Crusader states themselves.
What about church design?
Crusader churches were typically built in the French Romanesque style, which was dominant at the time. You can see it in the 12th century rebuilding of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. They might retain some local Byzantine details, but the core patterns were often Northern French, Aquitanian, or Provençal. Sculpture also tended to follow Western styles, with only occasional hints of local Syrian influence.
Did local artistic traditions influence the Crusaders at all?
Yes, especially in decoration. We see the influence of indigenous artists, Byzantine, Syrian, Armenian, and things like shrine decoration, wall paintings, and especially illuminated manuscripts produced in the 12th and 13th centuries. Frankish artists clearly borrowed techniques and iconographic styles, leading to a kind of cultural synthesis.
Any specific examples?
The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem had extensive wall mosaics, a technique not common in the West then, but widespread in Byzantium and the Crusader states, done in a distinctive, original style blending influences. Manuscript workshops in cities like Acre clearly had Italian, French, English, and local craftsmen working together, leading to cross-fertilization. Look at the Melisande Psalter, a famous example made for Queen Melisande. It shows this blend. They even started producing icons, something unfamiliar to the Franks initially, sometimes in a Western style or depicting Western saints. This is even seen as a possible origin point for Italian panel painting.
What about intellectual exchange? Translations?
There were some translations done, particularly in Antioch, but it seems to have been less significant than the intellectual exchange happening through Muslim Spain and Sicily during the same period. The main impact was visual and material, less textual.
How are these massive crusades financed? It must have cost a fortune.
A huge fortune. Crusade finance and the taxation developed to support it actually left a lasting legacy. It stimulated the European economy in some ways. Property became more readily available as nobles sold or mortgaged lands to go. Coinage and precious metals circulated more. The expeditions created massive demand for supplies, food, weapons, shipping, which benefited merchants and artisans, especially in port cities.
Did it lead to new forms of taxation?
Yes, special levies and taxes for crusades became common. This contributed to the growth of more centralized financial administrations by kings and the papacy. It also played a role in the development of representative bodies like parliaments, as rulers needed consent to raise these extraordinary taxes.
And it boosted trade between East and West.
Definitely. Transporting pilgrims and crusaders was big business for Italian maritime cities like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa. They gained valuable trading privileges in the crusader ports, becoming key intermediaries for luxury goods from the East, silks, spices, etc. Even with the conflict, trade with the Muslim world expanded overall. European merchants benefited from technological improvements in shipping and business practices, and long-distance trade grew significantly, using the crusader ports as a major conduit.
So despite the conflict, business continued.
Often, yes. Economic realities frequently trumped religious hostility or political tensions, especially for the merchant cities.
Thinking about the legacy of the Crusades today, it seems really complex and often controversial.
Extremely. In the West, the Crusades have often been romanticized, creating national mythologies, tales of chivalry and heroism, think Richard the Lionheart, but they left few lasting positive marks on the landscape or culture of the Middle East itself.
And in the Muslim world, the memory is very different.
Very different, and it's evolved. In modern times, particularly with the rise of political Islam, the Crusades are often invoked as a historical parallel for Western interference or aggression. Figures like Saladin are celebrated as heroes who resisted the invaders. The Crusades are framed as the beginning of a centuries-long struggle against Western Christian states, feeding into modern jihadist narratives.
Secular Arab nationalists also use the Crusades?
Yes, but often emphasizing the angle of Western imperialism, seeing the Crusades as an early example of colonial exploitation. And frequently, parallels are drawn between the Crusades and later events, most notably the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, which is sometimes explicitly referred to as a new Crusader state by its opponents.
And in the West today, are there opposing parallels drawn?
Yes, unfortunately. Some right-wing or nationalist circles in the West draw the opposite parallel. They see modern Western or Christian civilization as being under a religious or demographic threat from Islam, similar to the situation they perceive existed during the Crusades. They sometimes adopt Crusader symbols or rhetoric to frame contemporary political or cultural conflicts as a continuation of that historical struggle, using it for justification against a perceived religious enemy.
So the Crusades are still being used and interpreted through the lens of modern conflicts and identities on all sides.
Very much so. Their legacy is actively contested and politically charged.
Just briefly, for listeners interested in digging deeper, how do historians study the Crusades? What kind of sources are there?
It's a vast field. Historiography, the history writing is complex. Broadly, you have three types of sources. First, primary sources. Works written during the medieval period by participants or contemporaries, chronicles, letters, official documents, poems, plus archaeology.
Who are some key primary sources for, say, the First Crusade?
You have Latin chronicles like the anonymous Gesta Francorum, Deeds of the Franks, Albert of Aachen, Fulcher of Chartres, who went on the crusade. From the Byzantine side, Anna Komnene's Alexiad is crucial. Muslim perspectives come later, but Ali ibn al-Athir's complete work of history covers it, as does the Armenian Chronicle of Matthew of Edessa. Many are available in translation now.
What about later Crusades?
The foundational history for the Crusader states themselves was written by William of Tyre in the late 12th century, Historia Rerum in Partibus Transmarinus Gestarum, History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea. There are continuations of his work. Eyewitness accounts exist for most major crusades, like Joinville for Louis IX's 7th Crusade, Villehardouin for the 4th Crusade. Arab and Byzantine sources offer different perspectives. Biographies of figures like Saladin are also important.
Then you have secondary sources, histories written later.
Right. Starting seriously in the 16th century, big multi-volume histories became popular in the 19th century, like Joseph-François Michaud's Histoire des Crusades. Voltaire and Edward Gibbon wrote about them in the 18th century. And today, there's a huge amount of modern scholarship available, countless books and articles analyzing every aspect.
And tertiary sources.
Things like encyclopedias dedicated to the topic. Alan V. Murray's The Crusades. An encyclopedia from 2006 is a major one, plus specialized bibliographies and genealogical resources that help scholars navigate the field. It's an incredibly rich and well-documented area of history.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear the Crusades were this incredibly multifaceted phenomenon. Religious faith was obviously central, but so were political ambition, economic opportunity, social pressures, just a whole tangle of motivation.
Absolutely. It wasn't just one thing, and the impact was profound, reshaping societies, economies, and political landscapes in both the East and the West in ways that lasted for centuries. We've uncovered surprising twists, like Crusades turning against fellow Christians, and complex figures who defy easy categorization.
It really makes you think. As we unravel this history, driven by faith, by power, by need, how do those same kinds of forces, those collisions of belief and ambition, continue to shape our world all these centuries later? Are the echoes closer than we think?
That's the lingering question, isn't it? The patterns, the justifications, the consequences, they often feel disturbingly relevant.
If you found this exploration into the Crusades compelling, definitely stick with History Unraveled. We'll be diving into more intricate corners of the past soon, exploring how these grand, often tragic human endeavors continue to inform our present.